All right. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Chris Juergens.
Sure. Can everyone hear and see me? I'm not sure if I'm on camera or not. I suppose it doesn't matter. All right. All right. Well, thanks for joining me during your lunch break here. So I was invited to do a brief presentation, and it's going to be divided into three very unequal parts. One is just a little bit more about myself, a little introduction, and how I came to be at History Colorado working on this project. Then a presentation on some of the work that I had done previously to coming here that helps explain my connection to mountain warfare more generally. And finally, sort of an update on the current state of the collection, some of the projects that we have ongoing right now, and some of the things that I'm hoping to do during my 2-year tenure here. Oh, yeah. All right, hopefully you can hear me a little better now. Okay, so I'm originally from upstate New York, Catskill Mountains, and also spent the first 10 years of my life living in Germany. Not a military family, just happened to be over there. And so I grew up with German as actually my first language, so English was my second. Attended Binghamton University for my BA, was so indecisive that I ended up triple majoring in history, comp lit, and Russian area studies. And basically had an eye towards, already having German, I wanted to add Russian, and really had an eye towards working on the Eastern Front in World War II. And decided to pursue my MA at Binghamton, and basically was talked out of my project by one of my advisors, who just said there's not enough interest in American universities for that sort of thing, and he advised that I switch to something a little bit broader, or at least with broader appeal. And so I switched my projects to an early modern European project where I worked on German mercenary troops or so-called mercenary troops in the American Revolution, the so-called Hessians. And so I started that project at Binghamton and then continued through the PhD at Florida State. And there had an opportunity to do a lot of international research and national over on this side too, working at George Washington's Mount Vernon, the David Library of the American Revolution, the Clements Library up in Michigan, and also had the opportunity at Florida State to at least keep my interest in World War II going by volunteering at the Institute on World War II and the Human Experience that's at home there. That's an archive with about 8,000 collections and growing. Sort of the founding collection was the Tom Brokaw Collection that he had put together with a bunch of Greatest Generation stuff. And it's grown from there, and we have all branches of service represented, and it's primarily a letters and photographs collection. So it was sort of aimed at academic researchers. And so I had some great experience there processing collections and doing a lot of the work that the curators do. But also through my studies at Florida State, I had the opportunity while working on the dissertation to kind of cheat a little bit. And while I was over in Germany, especially doing research for my dissertation, I took the opportunities to steal away on the weekends and do my World War II research. And so some of that I'd like to introduce to you here today and give you an idea of my connection to mountain warfare specifically. So I had an interest as a young kid, actually through a family connection, in a very particular German infantry division, the 97th Jaeger Division, and was able to pursue that, like I said, while I was in Germany, and had the opportunity to steal away and consult some archives and do some additional research there. And I managed to contact the last known representative of the Veterans Association over there. So in stark contrast to what we have here with the 10th Mountain, German Veterans Associations tended to be very closed off. They had no descendants components whatsoever. And basically most of those veterans organizations disbanded in the early 2000s as members became too old to attend. And so here I sort of on a limb just wrote an email to the last known representative of this organization, and he happened to write back. And at the time he was 89, which was pretty remarkable for him answering an email actually. But we had a couple back and forths about source basis for the division, and finally he invited me down to his home in Bavaria to come have a chat with him. And so this presentation is going to be about some of those conversations that I had with him and some of the additional research that can be done with alternative source bases. So here, just to give you some signposts of how this is going to break down, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project writ large and its sources, Then specifically this particular veteran's experiences. Richard Harrer is his name, incidentally. His childhood in Nazi Germany, joining the army, his experience on the front line in early 44, attending war college and mountain warfare training, then returning to the front with the defense of Silesia in 45, then his captivity with the Russians, and finally lessons learned and remaining questions in the project. So here too, there are plenty of archives that you can consult. And one of the first stops, sort of standard for any American researcher, is the National Archives in DC. And there's NARA 1 and NARA 2. I went to NARA 2 where most of the modern historical pieces are kept, including on the third floor, I think it is. They have a huge microfilm collection dedicated to German military sources in World War II. And basically how that came about is that the US Army at the end of the war captured millions of pages of documents from the German military and the German government. And before they returned that material in the 1960s, they microfilmed everything, every last page. And in many ways, actually, that material is thereby a lot more accessible than in the United States than it is in Germany, because Germany is a little bit bureaucratic and old-fashioned when it comes to research. And so you actually have a lot of German researchers who come over to the United States to consult these microfilms because it's so much easier than dealing with the German bureaucracy. But so there are some interesting files there, personnel files for Army officers, as well as divisional and it goes down to the division level, but obviously regiments, or excuse me, corps level and Army level files as well. Then over in Germany, the equivalent, and unfortunately the picture doesn't show this, it's actually in Freiburg, is the cutest little medieval town, but the German military archives are on the outskirts in the industrial sector, and so it's sort of an ugly building here that you have to go visit that unfortunately doesn't reflect the great little historic town in southwest Germany. But that is the Federal Military Archives there. They're split from the main archives are up in Berlin. But so here you can go to the southwest corner, and everything and anything that is German military history from 1870 onwards that has survived can be found there. And thankfully, they've I guess just because of a lot of international interest, they're among the most progressive of the German archives when it comes to new technologies. So even while for my dissertation, I was forbidden from taking pictures of any documents, and I had to hand transcribe letters from the 1700s. Here at the military archives, you could actually there was a dedicated photographing table where you could take pictures, and the German government just instituted a new grant to digitize a majority of the military holdings for World War II. So some great advances being made there. And finally, another source space that I consulted was in the city archives of the city of Bad Tölz in Bavaria, another cute little medieval town. Bad Tölz might be familiar to some people because there was actually a US Army base there in the 50s and 60s. And it's a cute little medieval town. It actually used to be the beer brewing capital of Bavaria. They would actually brew all the beer there and ship it upriver to Munich for the Oktoberfest every year. And today, it was spared most of the, it was spared from the war basically because it was not an important military target, so it wasn't targeted for any bombing or anything like that. It was also the home, incidentally, of the SS Officers Training Academy, and that actually became the U.S. military, the U.S. Army facility after the wars. That same building, which still stands today. But the reason the city archives of Bad Tölz were interesting for this project is that Bad Tölz was the divisional seat of the 97th Division. So they didn't have a whole lot of troops stationed there. There simply weren't any barracks or any room to do that, but the staff was headquartered in Bad Tölz when they originally established it. And so it sort of became this, this representative, like this divisional home in sort of an abstract sense. And so when the Veterans Organization disbanded in 2007, they donated all of their materials to the city archives. And so that was an interesting stop to make there. And then finally, we have Richard Harrer himself. I actually just spoke to him on the phone the other day, and he's still kicking and doing well. He's 95 now and lives in his home, still in his own home in Bavaria with his wife, who's also 95. And they're doing, I think, reasonably well for their age. And it's really was such a delight over the last, I guess it's been 6 years now that I've interviewed him every year except for this year. And really some amazing stories that came out of that. So Richard Harrer is sort of an interesting, almost stereotypical case for a German youth growing up with Nazi Germany. So he was the son of a World War I veteran who had been who'd served in a Bavarian unit during the First World War. And his particular year, or the Jahrgang as they call it in Germany, born 1925, was basically the first year where service in the Hitler Youth became mandatory for German youths. So he was among the first who were, I mean, more or less forcibly conscripted into this organization. And you can sort of imagine it as sort of a glorified Boy Scouts. I mean, they did a lot of the same stuff as you can see in this picture here, which is a propaganda picture that was taken by a propaganda company. But it's they did a lot of that sort of stereotypical Boy Scout stuff. They did a lot of camping, they did music, they did community projects, but they also did some rudimentary military drill. And they're clearly, especially by the later part of his, or the latter part of his Hitler Youth service, it was pretty clear that they were being prepared for service in the army. Here's a picture of his graduating class in 1942. He actually made his Abitur, as the Germans called it, so he was actually preparing to go to university. And many of his classmates, and him included, were able to attend a few classes before they shipped off to military service, and then sort of had that promise that, you know, as soon as the war is over, they can go finish their degrees. And what's sort of interesting here, so they're all wearing their Hitler Youth uniforms. You can tell by the armbands there. And as noted on the slide here, so this is his graduating class. So these are all 17 and 18-year-olds. And before the end of the year, 5 of them would be killed in action, and quite a few more before the war would be over. But before they could go off to military service, there was another program that the German government had instituted in the mid-30s, and that was the Reichsarbeitsdienst, or the RAD. It's the Reich Labor Service, and it's basically the equivalent of, I mean, think of the Civilian Conservation Corps. You had military uniforms, you had tents and camps, but basically they would be used, so sort of these semi-military formations that would be used for public works projects. So building roads, building canals, and towards the end of the war, building tank ditches. They tended to be far away from the front, so they tended to be employed in Germany or in the occupied territories, but in some isolated cases, there were some RAD units that served at the front lines as well, building defenses and the like. So Richard served in a unit in the Harz mountains and basically cleared roads and worked on local infrastructure there. And what's sort of interesting to note too is that the SS was actively recruiting men straight out of the RAD service, and basically their big appeal was that if you volunteered for the SS units, that you could leave this mandatory labor service early, because it was really not a particularly fun time, and so that they used sort of as a sales pitch to get people to volunteer for the SS. But Richard had actually, before he reached RAD, had volunteered for the mountain troops. And so he actually had a legitimate excuse when the SS recruiter came to him to ask to volunteer. And he said, nope, I've already volunteered for the mountain troops. And so he went through basic training like everyone else. And here's a picture from a basic training unit in France. He was also trained in France, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily the same facility you see here. Here's some soldiers working on MG42s, practicing reloading. But all of the German mountain troops went through basic training first, of course, before they did any kind of advanced training. And actually, at this point in the war, Richard was actually sent to the front before he had a chance to do his mountain warfare training. He actually had to return later after frontline service to complete that. So after he finished his basic training, he was sent out to his unit. And so this was the 97th Jaeger Division. And it's sort of an interesting unit. I'm not sure why Google has now decided to flip this picture, but hopefully you can tell that it's a map of the Soviet Union. But the Jaeger Divisions had been specially created in December 1940. There were 5 of them to start with. And it was basically a light infantry formation with mountain training that was specifically designed and raised for fighting in the Soviet Union, which obviously the Germans knew was going to be coming the following year. And so the 97th Jaeger Division had that additional training, and it harkens back to I'll talk about that in a couple of slides, but harkens back to sort of a German light infantry tradition that goes back to the 30 Years' War. But the 97th Jaeger had so been specifically raised for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 41, and had participated on the Eastern Front basically from then on. I mean, they were never relocated to another front. And as you can hopefully tell on this map a little bit here, it kind of shows their path along the southern front. So they were part of Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union. So by the time Richard joined his new unit in 44, they were in Moldavia, so near Romania there, and had just come off of a major offensive, or actually, I mean, the way the Germans did these fighting retreats, and it was a relatively quiet time on the front. They did have multiple engagements, but compared to what had come before and what would come after, it was a relatively quiet time when he arrived at the front. And so mostly what he remembered is building entrenchments. So you start with your foxhole and then you expand it to a trench line, and then you have observation posts, et cetera, and they all dug those by hand. And just little anecdotes about, for example, how the troops became adept at what they called cracking lice, because they had a huge lice epidemic there, and there was a cracking noise that the lice would make when you separated their heads with your fingernails, and so they called that cracking lice. And so that was the most common pastime in the trenches. Yes, enjoy your lunch. Yeah, and then they had and sort of other fun little, frontline stories, like the fact that he enjoyed shaving, kind of having that connection to sort of normalcy even at the front line. And so he wanted to make sure to shave every morning, but getting hot water was nearly impossible. But what he said, what you could get in abundance was terrible coffee. And so he actually ended up shaving every morning with coffee instead of hot water. But so Richard, having made his Abitur and having been, destined for university and such, had a special note in his personnel file, is that he was an ROB, as it was called, a reserve officer candidate, essentially. And so the way the German system works is the Germans don't have, or at the time did not have, a military academy. They did not have an ROTC program or anything like that. If you wanted to become an officer, you were enlisted first. Which is sort of an interesting approach, but kind of the philosophy behind it was that if you're going to be a leader, you need to learn how to be a follower first. And so when you had that little notice in your personnel file, they made sure that the unit you were assigned to would be a Frontbewährung, is what they call it. So basically that you had 6 months at the front lines with a unit that is actively engaged in combat. So they wanted to make sure that you basically had a baptism under fire, and that would help tease out for your superiors whether or not you were actually qualified to go through officer training. So Richard was able to get a passing grade there. He got recommendations from his NCOs and his officers. And so he was sent, after his 6 months at the front, he was sent to the Army War College in Wiener Neustadt, Austria. And here's his graduating class from Wiener Neustadt, standing in front of the fountain that's in front of the school. And just sort of interesting side note, the Kriegsschule Wiener Neustadt is actually the Austrian military academy that had been founded under Maria Theresa in the 1700s. So they used the same building, same facility. It had been the Austrian military academy and now was a German army officer candidate school. Here you can sort of tell in the picture in the front line, sitting down there are all of the instructors. These instructors were all hardcore frontline veterans. So this is something they would rotate these instructors in and out, but they wanted to make sure that these were guys who had really, been there and done that, who were instructing these new cadets. In fact, Richard there had a fun story too, that one of the most respected instructors there was someone who had earned the Knight's Cross for combat heroism on the Eastern Front. But he had actually been, and he was an officer, but he had been a battlefield commission case. And he actually had never gone through any of the formal instruction that he was now supposed to actually give the cadets. And so they sort of laughed, because here was this, decorated war hero who, while he was instructing his new students, had to keep looking up at the wall at the posters to actually remember the lessons that he's supposed to be giving them, because he really hadn't had a chance to internalize it himself. While he was at the military academy, or while he was going through his military officers training there, there's sort of an interesting episode that happened in German diplomatic and military history, and he had a chance to participate in that. In October 1944, Admiral Horthy, who was the dictator of Hungary, it turned out, the Germans found out that he was having secret negotiations with the Soviets to take Hungary out of the war. And he had actually dispatched his younger son to go talk to the Soviets. And the Germans got wind of this, and obviously this was a big problem for them, because Hungary was an important ally for them and was holding up a substantial part of the front, and was also a source of resources and maneuvering and supply lines. And so Hitler dispatched Otto Skorzeny, who was a famous SS officer. He had actually been the one who led the rescue operation for Mussolini off of Gran Sasso when he had been imprisoned. And Otto Skorzeny took a bunch of SS units and any army units he could find, which included the entire class at the War Academy Wiener Neustadt. And they made their way as fast as they could to Budapest to seize the palace, to seize Horthy, and ensure a transfer of power to a fascist government that would stay in the war and continue to support Germany. And so as part of his class there, they were sent in as regular kind of frontline combat troops. They had no idea it was a super secret operation. They had no idea where they were going, but they were on their way to Budapest to help secure this transfer of power away from Admiral Horthy. After he finished his officer candidate school training, he was off to Mittenwald in Bavaria, which is near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, famous ski area, of course. And that is also home of the Gebirgsjägerschule, of the mountain warfare school. The Germans actually had several different mountain warfare schools, but this was the main one used by army troops. And so he spent a good amount of time there doing exactly the sort of training that you saw happening at Camp Hale. I mean, down to, so they did the mountain climbing, they did the skiing, and a lot of the same instructional techniques. It's actually very interesting how many parallels exist between those training approaches.
Just a side note, the first American mountain troop manuals were almost word for word graphic copies of German mountain troop manuals.
And that makes sense. In case the virtual participants didn't hear David, he just mentioned that the early manuals that were used by the U.S. Army were practically word for word transcriptions of the German manuals from the German warfare school. So here I just wanted to take a quick note here to talk about Jaeger history and heritage, and some of the heritage of mountain warfare troops. And actually, it's interesting that that happens to tie back into my what ends up being my dissertation as well. The Germans were actually among the first to develop this sort of Jaeger doctrine that eventually resulted in mountain warfare training. And it evolved out of the 30 Years' War. It was sort of a new play on skirmishers, which obviously are as old as ancient Rome and ancient Greece. But basically, the idea was that you could have some slightly better trained troops in looser formations that can protect your flanks, that can protect your baggage train, and that can be employed a little bit more strategically than your run-of-the-mill line troops. And so this is something that the Germans had developed very well by the 18th century. They had a stellar reputation for exactly this kind of warfare, and so Jaeger became synonymous with those kinds of troops. And the etymology of the term Jaeger there is, so in German it means hunter, and it literally speaks to the fact that they were actively recruiting these kinds of troops from community hunters and foresters and people who were familiar with working in that kind of environment. And also because they were from those kinds of areas and from those kinds of professions, they also tended to be well-versed in, also in camping and basic mountaineering, but also in, for example, the functionalities of rifles, which were a lot more complicated than muskets. And so that Jaeger doctrine remained with the German military going forward. And during the First World War, and that's the connection that you'll probably be familiar with the 10th Mountain Division, the Germans actually took about, I think it was like 15,000 Finnish troops. And Finland at the time was a territory of Tsarist Russia. And they actually took these volunteers out of Finland. They smuggled them into Imperial Germany and were training them in this Jaeger doctrine because they thought it was well suited to the environments of Finland. But basically the idea was to have, during the First World War, is to have these Finnish troops start an independence movement and a violent uprising against the Tsarist government to help get the Russians out of the war. As it turns out, of course, the Russians actually jump out of the war in 1917 as surrounding the events of the Russian Revolution, before that Jaeger training could be completed. However, those 15,000 Finns still ended up going back to Finland and continued that Jaeger tradition and developed it for their own independent military after 1919. And the Jaeger, then, those Finnish Jaeger troops are the ones who inspired that same kind of development in the United States when it was big in the news during the Continuation War of 39-40, that these relatively small Finnish forces were able to hold off the invading Red Army, which is was a pretty remarkable story. So to get back to Richard Hara, after his mountain warfare training, he actually never got a chance to use it on the front line because when he was dispatched back to his unit, now as an officer, a company commander of an understrength company of about 60 men, he was deployed to Silesia, I guess I don't quite have that slide yet. But anyway, so they were dispatched to Silesia, where the invading Red Army had pushed to some important industrial sectors there. And he mentioned, I mean, some of the challenges there. I mean, basically at this point, all they were doing is doing fighting retreats into German territory. And you may have come across this name before if you're a World War II buff, General Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. Schörner was famous as the Bloody Ferdinand. He was a committed Nazi party member and considered one of the most brutal and dedicated to the end, loyal Nazis that existed in the army structure. And by the end of the war, he was in charge of an army group that included the 97th Jaeger Division. And he had a reputation for, as you can see in that dramatic image to the right, of hanging his own men if he suspected any kind of desertion or even just shirking, as they called it. You know, if it was a soldier who was caught behind the front line without an appropriate pass, or what was considered an appropriate pass or a reason to be there. He was incredibly brutal because he thought that was the only way to keep soldiers motivated at this stage in the war. As it turns out, sort of ironic is that while he insisted that everyone should fight to the last man, at the end of the war, he stripped off his uniform and jumped into a civilian vehicle and drove west as fast as he could, and was not captured by the Russians, unlike most of the men under his command. So, yeah, I suppose that's the way to do it if you can. So when May 45 rolled around, the 97th Jaeger Division was one of those that was practically encircled in former Czechoslovakia. And a bunch of the officers had managed, sort of like Schörner, had managed to grab some vehicles and drive west. And there are some isolated cases of members of the 97th who managed to get to American lines. But those are pretty dramatic escape stories. For most of the troops of the division, what awaited them was captivity in Russia. And actually, in Richard Harrad's case, even he and a couple of his men tried to escape to the west and almost succeeded until a certain Russian sentry figured them out that they had been German soldiers and weren't just Czech civilians. And so he started his long journey into captivity. Interestingly, where they started was at the former concentration camp Auschwitz, which had become a Red Army collection point for German POWs, and they spent several months there. And then they headed east on trains, and he ended up, his final stop was in Stalinogorsk in the Tula Oblast at a brown coal mine. And he actually spent the next 4.5 years there working in these mines, developing chronic bronchitis and all kinds of other ailments, of course. And pretty much living out a horrible existence as a POW in Russia. Interesting to note here, I mean, I was able to see at his house all of his letters home. His parents had kept them, of course. The first contact they got from their son, I mean, the first that they ever knew that he had survived was in August 1947, so over 2 years after the end of the war. And so that's the first sign of life that he was allowed to send home via the Red Cross. So he stayed until, I guess it was the beginning of 1949 that he was allowed to return home, along with some other men from his camp. But they sort of let them go in smaller groups depending on how much work they had done, and they did a sort of exit interview, which was an interesting process, because then they had originally captured all of these soldiers. They did an interview of each one to ascertain whether or not they had been involved in any atrocities. And also to tease out if any of them had been capitalists, as the Russians would have put it. So they would ask questions that would really confuse the soldiers, like, did you have a piano at your house, or how many tables and chairs did you have? And basically, it was intended to tease out whether or not they were upper class. And so when they were getting ready to release, they had the same exact interview repeated, and the officers who were interviewing them had the original documents in front of them so they could check to see whether the answers were the same that they gave, 4.5, 5 years before then. So basically, the lessons learned from this little project here, which is still ongoing and still something I'd like to expand in the future, but certainly you see the value of eyewitness accounts. And obviously that speaks to many of the strengths that we have with the 10th Mountain Division collection as well, not just here at HC, but at DPL as well, is that we have just a remarkable number of eyewitness accounts that can give you these little details that you don't get in kind of the normal history books, or even in the archival sources if you dig into the divisional documents and that sort of thing. It also has the effect of humanizing the war, because we do run into danger when you have, these huge divisions fighting these massive battles. You have the danger of kind of reducing war to statistics, and you sort of lose sight of the fact that these are human beings who are being sacrificed in the slaughter here. So eyewitness accounts are also great for humanizing the war in that sense. You also have the opportunity to fill in gaps of knowledge. In the case of the Germans on the Eastern Front, for example, that's hugely important because we actually have some dearth of knowledge when it comes, dearth of information when it comes to the source bases. Not only did the Soviets capture millions of pages of documents like the United States did, but in many cases, they still have not made those accessible in the archive. So they're still hidden away somewhere in Russia, and we have no idea what exists or when we might be able to see it. But furthermore, a lot of the German units, especially at the end of the war, had been instructed to destroy their documents before capitulation. And so the eyewitness testimony can be very important there to actually fill in some of those last critical weeks when no official documentation exists anymore. And of course, in terms of remaining questions, there's the mountain warfare training connection that interests me a lot, especially with the 10th Mountain Division, and that is something that begs some further investigation. I think would be interesting for a lot of members of the various mountain division associations. And there, basically, we just need to wait for travel to become possible again because those files are all in Germany and need to be consulted there. It would also be interesting to see the deployment of Jaeger elsewhere. And if you've followed me on Facebook, then you might have already seen some of these posts where I've found some documents that have been digitized for the 114th Jaeger that would have gone through a lot of the same training as the 97th, but the 114th by the end of the war were stationed in Italy. So obviously that makes them very interesting as opponents of the 10th Mountain. And finally, we can find more unknown accounts now that we know that the value of these eyewitness accounts. You always have these opportunities, and we see them every day at History Colorado, things that, donations that come in that are total surprises, just amazing little sources or diaries or letters that you had no idea, of course, that existed and are coming out of the woodwork now. So there's always exciting new opportunities. So finally, for the last part here, I hope you enjoyed that little talk on some German military history, but now I definitely want to talk about what's happening in History Colorado and give you an update on the collections here and where some things are headed. So in terms of the current state of the collection, talk about some strengths, weaknesses, and some resolutions there. A clear strength of the collection is its size. We have over 2,500 artifacts. There's a great diversity there. A lot of them have fantastic provenance, so we know exactly who used it and when and where. The weaknesses are sort of a function of that same strength. It was just overwhelming when some of the stuff came in. You get the sense that there was not a dedicated curator to deal with those incoming collections. And so a lot of that stuff just, it's a cataloging challenge to go back and find the paperwork and reestablish those ties between, the items, their donor, the story behind those items, and then also any connections that they might have with materials at DPL that would be interesting for researchers. So the resolutions to some of that obviously is just following those paper trails. And then also establishing, as James has already talked about a little bit, for example, in that prop collection, is to kind of figure out, what is definitely worth keeping, what is maybe moving on to another institution, and what is, inauthentic or post-war that's been donated but sort of was grouped into the 10th Mountain stuff accidentally. So some of the new projects that we have currently going on. So one was put into motion before I came, but it's been really exciting to work on it on sort of the tail end. And that is an education trunk. And so basically it's another department here at History Colorado working in conjunction with the Colorado Department of Education. And it's a fantastic program. It's called, or the shorthand for it anyways, the trunk program. And there are different themes of Colorado history that can be signed out by 4th grade classrooms so that the students in those classes that have a Colorado history component to them at that grade level get the opportunity to interact with Colorado history directly and very actively. So have that kinetic connection to the past through real artifacts or facsimiles of real artifacts. And so we're excited to make the very first 10th Mountain Division education trunk for that purpose. Now, how that exactly is going to work in the age of COVID is still a little bit unclear, but at least we're going to have it ready in some capacity. So even if it has to switch to a virtual, sort of a virtual transfer, that will be doable once we have that all set. But so basically there is one possible way in which we have used some of these props that have been duplicates from the collection so that kids will get a chance to actually see, in the flesh, some of these items that make the 10th Mountain Division and its history unique in American military history, and certainly unique in terms of their connection to the history of Colorado. Another project that we're working on right now is this is an entirely new initiative, is a new kind of traveling display. And the idea is to basically have a couple of sort of small exhibits that can be rented out by public institutions such as libraries or schools that have small display spaces that are secure, that they can have a space to exhibit some original artifacts and some text that we provide to give their visitors a look into some interesting topics for Colorado history. And the very first one that we're doing and kind of test driving this with is the 10th Mountain Division. And so that's been really exciting to work on as well. And sort of it's a sort of nice counterpart to the education trunk that's aimed at fourth grade classrooms. This is much more aimed at more adult audiences, and that's reflected obviously in the text and the context, and also in some of the items that are being displayed there. And so there too, that is the destination for some of those so-called props that we have in the collection. Although there too, we're excited to include some items that do have good provenance that we can, tie that story into more humanizing factors by being able to tell visitors exactly who used these particular items. In terms of other new initiatives, some of you may have noticed I'm trying to be very active on social media. And thank you, Sepp, for the several shout outs in that regard already. But basically, as I've been going through the collection and cataloging things anyway, or I find some interesting tidbits from partner organizations or from working in the German archives, I share that stuff in the 10th Mountain Division Descendants and Friends group. If you have any suggestions on where else to share it, who else might be interested in that sort of thing, please let me know, and I'll happily share it there as well. And I would definitely welcome any opportunities to, provide links to this stuff for anyone else who wants to share it elsewhere or make use of that in some way. And then finally, we've been thinking about some more digital initiatives, other things that we can do in this sort of age of COVID that maybe gives people more direct access to the collection than's really been possible before, on the one hand because of technology, or desirable before because people just, I think, weren't used to thinking of the digital world in the way that we do now. And so there we are looking into some opportunities to make the collection a little bit more accessible and maybe have some behind the scenes events that are virtual or something like that. Recently, we had an Ask the Curator event hosted over Facebook Live where people were able to ask questions of the curators directly, which is not something they would, ordinarily get a chance to do when they just walk into the museum. And so we're thinking about some other initiatives like that we can give all of you and anyone who's associated with the 10th Mountain Division or has an interest in it, some new avenues to access the collection, even if those particular aspects aren't currently on display. So that is something, obviously, everyone would love to have their particular interest represented in a permanent display. But obviously, given the nature of exhibits, that's not really realistic all the time. But so this is another avenue by which we can have those materials be accessible and be utilized, independent of being in a static display here at the museum, where it has a relatively limited audience to people in Colorado. And so that's pretty much what we've got going here at History Colorado.